Think I'll be able to speed run filming and editing this in one day? Stand-up comedy sucks now, and stand-up comedians are some of the most cringe, obnoxious, and annoying people on the planet. Alarm bells go off every time I find out someone does stand-up because it's like a meme now that they're gonna be a manipulator or problematic or generally psychotic. There is nuance, but depending on who you're talking about and what decade you choose, there's a spotty history there. A history that's tarnished the legacy of stand-up. For me, I didn't always feel this way though. In the late 2000s and 2010s, I thought stand-up comedians were modern-day philosophers and great thinkers who had the ability to dissect and recontextualize politics, society, and the mundane in profound ways that would rewire your brain, giving you a new perspective or insight on any number of topics. I think I was lucky enough to have lived through some of the good years of comedy, but over the decades, it's gone through waves of being incredible art to really bad, lazy, and mean-spirited. We're now living in a time where once relatively progressive or straight-up anarchist comics are taking a wild turn down the alt-right conspiracy pipeline. In order to provide some proper context, I feel like I have to briefly summarize the history of stand-up from its early problematic roots to its evolution from slapstick to spoken word monologues. So get ready for one of my classic Cliff Notes history montages. Stand-up dates back to 19th century vaudeville variety shows where a guy would juggle rings and catch a bullet with his teeth while tap dancing, and early medicine shows where a snake oil salesman would entertain an audience with testimonials of an associate planted in the audience in order to sell some miracle elixir that was a bottle of opium, cocaine, and alcohol. Humorous monologues are probably the closest, oldest form of modern-day stand-up that replaced similar comedy minstrel shows of the time that fell out of fashion in, let me check my notes, 1978? Jesus Christ! By the 1930s, there was Abbott and Costello's famous Who's on First routine, a precursor to modern sketch, followed by the likes of Bob Hope, George Burns, and Milton Berle throughout the 40s and 50s, who all had backgrounds in vaudeville. The 60s ushered in the new wave of stand-up, where the classic brick wall backdrop became ubiquitous. That brick wall, by the way, originates right here in San Francisco at the old Hungry Eye nightclub that operated during the 50s up until 1970 when it closed, somehow not outliving fucking minstrel shows. This was also the time when uncensored shock comics were coming into prevalence, who pushed back against corrupt politics and obscenity laws, the most famous probably being George Carlin and his infamous 7 words routine. Then things got kind of weird in the 70s with Steve Martin and Andy Kaufman birthing anti-comedy, which was not for everyone and arguably a low point for general audiences who are used to the social satire of the previous generation. It would take a while before we all accepted the genius of Martin and Kaufman. Stand-up then exploded in the 80s, where it was much dirtier and, looking back, much more insensitive. Then the comedy bust happened, where an oversaturation of comedians and clubs tanked the industry for a while, but was the perfect environment for alternative comedy to flourish. It was like the grunge equivalent of comedy, being heavily influenced by improv that was absurd or surreal, that had a polemical bent. A word I had never heard of before doing this research. It's still pretty popular today, but at the time wasn't everyone's cup of tea. The scene was then reinvigorated in the 2000s thanks to people like Dave Chappelle and Louis C.K. and Bill Burr, despite having been working since the late 80s. They took a more relatable approach to comedy, redefining the narrative monologue style of joke writing that was probably closer to the old humorist monologues of the 10s and 20s with their overarching narrative or theme. Now, regardless of how you feel about those last 3 comedians today, their talent for storytelling was undeniable and ushered in a comedy boom that inspired countless people to take up comedy in some form, whether in writing or sketch or improv or YouTube video essays that no one asked for. Which leads us to the 2010s. And if you've caught on at this point, I've been singling out the men of stand-up comedy, and that's on purpose. For the last 15 or so years, it's felt like there was a scandal after scandal coming out every other week about something heinous a male comedian did or had been doing all along, either behind closed doors or on a stage under a spotlight. or on Twitter. Stand-up took a real nosedive, again, in my opinion, in the 2010s and only now feels like it's recovering to a certain extent. I mean, we won't know for probably another decade. That's how hindsight works. I'm also no expert by any means and kind of stopped paying attention to what was going on in the comedy scene several years ago, but have been seeing a positive change where fewer comics are relying on outdated stereotypes as comedy fodder. But still, every once in a while, I do come across a story of some bonehead comedian doing or saying something offensive or ignorant and then doubling down because they've never heard of the Streisand effect, who then say they're being canceled by the woke mob. In the worst cases, they're sliding headfirst down the alt-right pipeline, or conspiracy theory pipeline, which might just be the same pipeline. But why? And more importantly, how? Most things that rely on an individual's creativity require a bit of self-awareness or critical thinking or vulnerability, and to a certain extent, empathy. This seems to be a relatively new trend among stand-up comedians. In the past, there wasn't an entire infrastructure built around comedy that allowed thousands of comedians to reach millions of people 24/7. You had to physically go to a comedy club or tune into a radio broadcast at a specific time or buy their special etched into a celluloid Edison cylinder for your phonograph. They weren't constantly yapping on a podcast revealing all their unrefined hot takes that were probably just as awful and out of touch as modern comedians. I honestly don't think much has changed in comedy circles since the term first appeared in 1911. Just choked on my own spit. It's just that we didn't hear from them as frequently. 5 or 6 decades ago, audiences only got an idea of what they believed through an hour of manicured jokes and maybe the odd late night interview. Now, you can tune into one of their weekly podcasts and listen to them rant about traffic and airports and how they feel about trans people and immigrants and lady politicians. And it's fucking weird. Then there are the countless guest appearances on other comedian podcasts or TikTok clips of their boring fucking crowd work where they will inevitably say something classist or xenophobic or sexist that spreads across the internet unimpeded. It's like they're trying to alienate the audience that got them to where they are while courting the worst, dumbest fans who think misogyny and classism is funny because it owns the libs. Those people tend to be the loudest and most loyal who will continue paying for a Patreon subscription out of spite. Comedians who end up in this downward spiral would rather sell tickets to their shows regardless of the crowd they attract than apologize or, not spread misinformation and be a prick. This betrayal of trust is almost a foregone conclusion the moment a comedian makes it, reaching a certain level of notoriety. And maybe it's not that surprising when it happens because it's not like comedians are academics of intersectional feminism or internalized racism and are just as susceptible to alt-right indoctrination and sexism and misogyny and extremism as the next person, if not more so due to how siloed they become. I mean, they regularly play in those spaces, pulling material from that which is taboo or uncomfortable in order to poke fun at or deconstruct. There are levels to this where some comedians shift to a more egregious right-wing worldview than others. I always thought Ricky Gervais was a pretty progressive and even a leftist performer until he came out as a transphobe who didn't understand the difference between biological sex and gender identity. I just saw, hours before recording this, mind you, that Joe Rogan goes on a transphobic tirade in his newest special saying society's acceptance of their existence happened because a pervert wizard waved a wand and made it so? This is August 5th of 2024 and they're still beating this fucking horse. To the surprise of no one, he also made several observations about COVID in an attempt to squeeze blood from a stone. None of this is to say that Rogan has ever been of the progressive persuasion, libertarian, for sure, but up until COVID, he seemed like he was just questioning everything, even pushing back against some of his more extreme conspiracy theorist friends, like Eddie Bravo, who I think doesn't believe in space or something. And he's also a flat earther. But then he goes on and does whatever this is. Get it? It's funny because that's not what people sound like. Dave Chappelle was another comedian who felt pretty liberal to me, not like a full-blown conservative and definitely not a leftist, who regularly poked fun at societal double standards and norms and race discrimination before also going full transphobe. What is with comedians dying on that hill? Either he always felt that way, or it got a big reaction, or he was a stubborn ass who refused to actually listen to the trans community and doubling down made him feel superior. Who knows? His constant dogpiling is pretty infuriating, not only because his takes are just plain wrong, they're not even funny or clever, he's just punching down. Now, if they're not going full Nazi, they're at the very least evolving backwards into liberalism or staying put as an immovable moderate. Most of the time, these insulated comedians tend to make pretty minor missteps that could quickly and easily be resolved with an apology or an admission that they didn't know what the fuck they were talking about and probably shouldn't have said anything at all. Other times, it's an embrace of fringe ideas, some more silly than they are really all that harmful. The really terrible examples are when they turn on at-risk and marginalized fans, selling them down the river in order to rake in conservative ad money and Fox News appearance fees. There are plenty of other comedians who have joked about marginalized communities and things they don't understand that are at least funny, typically because they're self-deprecating, where the punchlines aren't at the expense of the people in those communities, but the expense of themselves or ignorant, hateful bigots. A good counter to Chappelle or even Rogan is somebody like Bill Burr, who has built his career basically doing the same kind of comedy, but is shown to continually learn and grow and has come around on certain topics. I'm not saying he's perfect, and he definitely has some blind spots. I don't always agree with some of his jokes myself, but to quote Burr himself, "What did you think he thought? And what does he think now?" At least he tends to act like a grown-up and admit that he's a dummy at the end of the day and is still able to see through the bullshit his peers peddle, like when he did push back against Rogan questioning the legitimacy of masks.
Let's not start this, John.
Do you, though?
Let's not start this. Okay?
Let's start it.
I don't want to start this bullshit. I'm not going to sit here with no medical degree, listening to you with no medical degree, with an American flag behind you, smoking a cigar, acting like we know what's up better than the CDC.
Or when Bill Maher was throwing his pseudo-intellectualism at him for 90 minutes.
Your wife must be a saint. Because, boy...
Because you're such a victim right now?
No, because you do like to, pick a fight about anything.
You just said I was stupid.
You don't realize that college campuses erupted with the kids demonstrating for Hamas? They are in with the terrorists?
They were for the Palestinians.
Well, it's sort of the same cause.
That supercut is hilarious. You should go watch the whole thing. Then you've got comedians who don't really dabble in conspiracy theories, but who put on a mask of progressivism as a way to cater to a certain underserved demographic. Take Matt Rife, for example, whose audience was largely made up of women. When criticized for pandering, he weaponized this perceived feminism against his audience and released an unfunny, misogynistic special in an attempt to gain more male fans by making low-effort astrology jokes, and no one has seen from him since. Or maybe we have, but he's just unrecognizable because of what he did to his face.
What's wrong with your face?
Tom Segura was a pretty apolitical, schlubby guy telling jokes about how weird Steven Seagal is to turning into a classist piece of shit, making fun of the pores the moment Joe Rogan befriended him. The worst offender, at least to me, on a personal level, has been Russell Brand. He embraced a calculated, flamboyant rock and roll style meant to make audiences clutch their pearls, and had a fast-paced, pseudo-cerebral style of comedy that bashed establishment systems like the monarchy, corporations, capitalism, tabloid journalism, and gender norms. He was also very open about his past addiction and substance abuse, where he would later go on to advocate for harm reduction policies and talked at length about implementing some empathy and understanding to those with substance use issues, and that society should view them as, people rather than simply criminals who lacked self-control.
By regarding addiction as an illness, by offering treatment instead of a more punitive approach, we can prevent people from committing crimes. Just personally, I was a criminal when I was a drug addict by virtue of my addiction and the ways that I had to acquire money to get drugs. Anecdotally, Chip was an armed robber in and out of Nick all the time. I hope you don't mind me telling them this. And other people I've met, criminality is a necessary component. Now, of course, we're not saying forget the victims, but I'm saying it's better to address the social situation pragmatically. And I think we all know this. By prescribing methadone to people, most people on methadone are using illegal drugs to supplement their habit. They're not addressing the root problems. We need to approach the victims with respect. Where there has been criminal behaviour, it needs to be dealt with correctly. But perhaps within the penal system itself, we can offer treatment to addicts, like the brilliant work that's done run by RAPT in various institutions and prisons.
So you'd say there needs to be carrot and stick, would you?
I don't think there needs to be a carrot or a stick. Both of those things seem like bizarre metaphors. I think what there needs to be is love and compassion to everybody involved. You need to, if people are committing criminal behaviour, then it needs to be dealt with legally, but you need to offer them treatment, not simply out of some airy-fairy that's all old hands and hug liberalism, but because it deals with the problem and it prevents further crimes being committed. Addicts that get clean at one day at a time through abstinence-based recovery, generally speaking, stop committing crimes. That's better for victims, it's better for the addict, it's better for society.
However, over the years, he's made some truly bizarre choices and is now a born-again Christian who showed up at the Republican National Convention and has voiced support for Trump. I'm not sure what kind of support, though, considering he's fucking British. I've talked at length about my own issues with addiction and substance use in the past, and it's what got me into the partner program on YouTube, and I'm really proud that that was the video that did it. The response to it was also overwhelming, with so many comments coming from people who were sober or working on their sobriety saying how much my video helped them, and I don't take that shit lightly. It's an important issue to me, not just because of my own predisposition, but because I grew up in an area rampant with drug abuse and alcoholism and saw firsthand how it destroyed people's lives and the lives of their families, my own included. As a society, we so flippantly disregard addiction as being caused by a lack of character or morals, and would rather just shrug our shoulders and move on with our day than actually listen and help. And I'm still working on my own addiction despite being sober. I'm not smoking cigarettes anymore, but I vape like a fucking high schooler. I've filled the void of regular dopamine hits released by drugs and alcohol with video games, and making these videos where every comment I get is a little bump of feel-good juice straight to the dome. Comedy is also something that gives you that dopamine and serotonin hit, and for a while I was seeking out new comedians the same way I would an 8-ball. God, it's dark, dude. I knew every line to all my favorite comedy bits. I knew all the legends in the scene and the effect they had on the art form. I was obsessed and thought for a while that I should even try my hand at it. I never did, because every time I would try to sit down and write a joke, my mind would go blank and I would forget what a punchline was. I'm more of an essay guy, turns out, hence YouTube. I think on some deep subconscious level, I enjoyed Russell Brand's comedy because of how open he was about his addiction, and I hadn't ever really seen a comedian address the taboo of what it's like being an addict before. I was first exposed to Russell Brand and Forgetting Sarah Marshall in 2008 when I was 21 and just getting into stand-up. And drugs and alcohol. I was a late bloomer. I know a lot of people started drinking and smoking and shit when they were like 13 to 16. I was a good boy. I had no idea who this strange, lanky weirdo was playing the standout character of Aldous Snow, and was immediately drawn to his dry, aloof delivery and wanted to see more. If I remember correctly, it was actually kind of hard to find any of his stand-up in 2008 because he was much bigger in the UK than he was in the States, and also, this is what YouTube looked like back then. Eventually, I was able to find his special Shame that is still available on YouTube in 8 separate parts, and was shocked that this hyperactive lunatic with a MySpace-era shotgun blast haircut was the same slick, sexy, cool guy from that movie. God, that was a tongue twister, huh? The first 15 minutes are him calling out toxic masculinity and what it means to be a man. It doesn't really hold up by today's standards and does become a little grating, but for 2008, it was pretty refreshing to see someone criticize masculinity and gender norms, and it was probably the first time I'd ever heard the term beta male. Or beta male.
Beta male.
I remember enjoying the special because there were a lot of things I related to as a skinny, emo man-child surrounded by men whose idea of masculinity was being able to lift heavy things and rejecting all things feminine for fear just beholding them would turn you gay. The entire special talks about feelings of shame, if you couldn't figure that out, which was something I was actively struggling with at the time, and was probably the genesis of my own addiction. He also goes on for far too long about how great sex is, which is true, in what is essentially a prolonged jerk-off bit, and how he replaced drugs with sex, which is unfortunate foreshadowing. He goes on exhaustively about being libeled in the media in an overlong bit where he reads from a magazine, and his following specials all basically followed the same structure, including the magazine bit at the end. Are you a prop comic? Just write your own material. In 2013, he released Messiah Complex, and this is where the granola spiritual aspects of his personality became more of a focal point in his comedy. I mean, it was always there. This is what the stage design of Shame looked like, after all. In that special, he spoke about the perils of manipulative advertising, drug laws, and how he's actually, just like Malcolm X, Gandhi, and Jesus Christ. Another on-the-nose title that lacked any subtlety at all, but, you know, what do I expect from a guy who used to dress like this? Dude, I didn't put the fucking light up next to me, man. You idiot. It's like a thing I've been trying to do lately. See, it adds a little something, right? God, it'd be great if I just had a space I could leave this stuff all set up and not a fucking garage. Okay, where was I? This was probably peak Brand, where he began getting regular acting jobs, but before podcasting, where it started to become clear that he wasn't the enlightened, reformed addict who used his controversial image as a tool to stick it to the man. His onstage persona was basically a smokescreen of lampshading his sexual predation. Throughout the years, he's been accused of emotional and sexual misconduct, sexual assault, grooming, indecent exposure, and creating a hostile work environment. Oh, and also, he was buddy-buddy with Jimmy Savile. Google that if you want to have a bad day. Brand has been sober for over 20 years, but based on the accounts of his victims, he just replaced drugs with sex, and clearly not consensually. A lot of these accusations have actually come out in the last couple of years, and in that time, basically since the start of COVID, he amassed a conspiratorial right-wing and libertarian audience through his YouTube channel by spreading vaccine misinformation and becoming a COVID denier, among other things. Basically, he took a page from the Joe Rogan playbook. Now, this is a pretty common thing for crunchy spiritual individuals to end up on the other side of the alt-right pipeline. The modern-day granola hippie types tend to share similar values with neo-traditional conservatives, declining vaccinations, being all about independence and purity and living a back-to-the-land lifestyle, a distrust of government and its agencies meant to make sure you're not feeding your kids heavy metals, as well as an interest in alternative medicine and personal training, and blaming every ailment on 5G. The Venn diagram is almost a circle where the only difference is tie-dye and puka shell accoutrements and owning an F-250 with a 2A sticker on the back. More recently, Brand has become a born-again Christian, getting baptized just this year, which is quite odd considering he'd claimed to be a Buddhist since at least 2009. Now he's going around saying that society is immoral and needs to find its way back to Christ.
People seem more and more adrift from even the most rudimentary morality. How is it that we find our way back to Christ?
There was a decent amount of press about his first month as a Christian around the same time that even more sexual assault claims were coming out. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist myself, but the timing seems a little convenient, like a deliberate PR move to shift focus away from the allegations. He's also used his own past troubles with drugs and alcohol as justification for his misdeeds and overt spirituality, claiming that he's more enlightened and that being baptized was a new beginning for him. And it pisses me the fuck off. You don't get to use your addiction as an excuse for bad behavior, and you definitely don't get to use your sobriety as proof you're a better person. Now, you're a better person now. It's just so upsetting to see someone like Brand, who did some objectively positive things for those suffering with addiction by advocating on their behalf, only to taint all that good work by using his own addiction to continue to do bad shit. Hell, even using his newfound love of J-Town as a distraction is reprehensible behavior, and I'm not even a defender of organized religion. So not only is he a sex maniac who has victimized countless people, he betrayed his audience of recovering addicts and those on their path to sobriety. His notoriety and advocacy could have had the power to push society one step forward toward a more empathetic and pragmatic future of addiction awareness, but all the bad shit he did just put us 2 steps back, and it's unforgivable. I can handle someone like Tom Segura making classist jokes that lead to a mass exodus of his fans that really only affect him, or Matt Rife killing his golden goose before it's laid an egg because he wanted other men to like him and take him seriously. Real beta male behavior, in my opinion.
Beta male.
What I really can't stand for are when influential people like Joe Rogan or Dave Chappelle push transphobic rhetoric because it gets views, despite the quality and intent of the audience that eats that shit up, and only just emboldens them to say the fucked up thing that then leads to real world violence. On a personal level, I feel the most let down by someone like Brand, who had the opportunity and ability to give back to an at-risk community he was intimately familiar with. only to mislead and forsake those who relied on his efforts of compassion and grace. These comedians would rather do the easy thing of courting the most loyal sycophants who shower them in adulation that erupts from a place of hate and bigotry rather than not do that. I guess because it's easier and you get paid more? I don't know, man. Fucking false idols fall. That's the video. Thanks so much for sticking around. If you made it this far, that means you're special. The rules on the channel are you gotta like, you gotta comment, and you gotta share, and you gotta subscribe. I think like 80% of my viewers are not subscribed, so that would be pretty cool if you could do that. You can also go over and follow me on Instagram, where I post updates and memes about the channel. What are you still doing here? The video's over. Vanish.